The Bible is a huge cohesive story about mankind's relationship to God and where that relationship breaks down. Like any good story, the conflict comes early on in the narrative. If you're at all familiar with the story of the origin of sin in Genesis, you'll probably be familiar with that bizarre part where God curses the serpent who deceived Adam and Eve, and makes a strange promise about the woman's seed. God said to the snake, "I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel." As is typical with Bible interpretation, Bible interpreters haven't always been on the same page about what this verse actually means. Over the years, two major theories have risen to the top. The first interpretation of Genesis 3:15 is pretty simple. It's just a simple story about snakes, and why humans don't like those nasty, slithery danger ropes. This interpretation might not be as simplistic as it sounds, and today many prominent scholars like it more than other interpretations. Their reasoning is, Genesis is an ancient book from the Near East, and in ancient literature, there's a common literary phenomenon known as etiology, or what we might call today an origin story. It's a simple literary device found in almost every ancient society, explaining why something happens the way it does. If, for example, you're in ancient Mesopotamia, you might ask, why do the crops dry up 6 months of the year? Oh, that's because Dumuzi, the god of crops and vegetation, is cursed to stay in the underworld half of the year. Or if you're in ancient Norway, you might ask, where did the gods come from? Well, there was a giant cow who licked the salty ice of the cosmos for 3 days until Buri came out, and he became the grandfather of Odin. I couldn't make this up if I tried. In Genesis, some interpreters believe the author is doing something similar to these examples, explaining a natural phenomenon using a mystical story. This view was popularized in the Middle Ages by an influential Jewish rabbi known as Rashi, who was born in France around the same time as the First Crusades. Rashi's writings went on to influence many of the Protestant reformers on the subject of the Old Testament, including John Calvin. I interpret this verse to mean simply that there should always be a hostile strife between the human race and serpents, which is now apparent, for by a secret feeling of nature, man abhors them. The other major interpretation of the curse against the snake is that it's a prophetic story prefiguring Jesus' own victory over Satan through his death and resurrection. In this view, Jesus is the seed, or offspring of the woman, who will strike the head of the snake, who is Satan. At the same time, Satan, like a venomous snake, will deal Jesus a killing strike. In Christian tradition, this verse is called the Proto-Evangelion, meaning the first gospel, because it is the first time in the Old Testament that the good news of the Messiah, Jesus, is prophesied. However, the question for us here is which of these interpretations of the promise in Genesis 3:15 is more likely to be correct. Although you're not likely to end up in the cool kids club of modern theology for siding with the Messianic interpretation of this verse, I don't think it's the worst option. The biggest red flag for most people with this interpretation is it just sounds too Christian. What were the Jewish people supposed to make of this verse before Jesus came along? Doesn't it seem more likely that Christians just read this meaning back into Genesis 3 later on down the road? I was actually surprised to find that before the Middle Ages, the Messianic interpretation of this verse was the dominant view, even among Jewish rabbis. Even before the New Testament was written, ancient Jewish interpreters seemed to have no problem seeing prophecies about the Messiah very early on in Genesis. Ancient Jewish Bible commentaries like Targumim Pseudo-Jonathan, Neophiti, Onkelos, and Genesis Rabbah 23:5 all assumed a Messianic interpretation of this verse. It was only after the Jesus movement in the 1st century that Jewish writings began to sponge out some of these long-held Messianic interpretations. Okay, so maybe this interpretation of Genesis 3:15 is just as Jewish as it is Christian. But does it match the rest of the story in Genesis? Like any Bible nerd will tell you, when interpreting a passage, context is king. This verse in Genesis comes after the first major conflict of the book, and tells us it will lead to an ongoing conflict between the snake and the woman, between her seed and his seed. There's going to be a chosen seed and a rejected seed, locked in constant combat. As good Bible readers, we probably shouldn't expect this plot point to fizzle out at the end of this chapter. What we should be looking for is a progression of this plot conflict, building throughout the rest of the story up to some sort of climax. In the story of Cain and Abel, for example, who are the first seeds of the woman, we see a similar theme as in Genesis 3. God gives clear instructions that must be obeyed. God warns the main characters not to give in to their desires. The main characters brazenly disobey God's instructions. God interrogates the main characters, seeking to know where and why. Characters are cursed by God and banished. A seed of the woman is then highlighted, in contrast against the evil seed. In this case, Eve gives birth to another child, Seth, who fills in the place left by Abel's death. Another similar story follows close after with Noah and his dysfunctional family in Genesis 9. Here, Noah's sons experience their own fall narrative, ending with one being chosen over another. The whole story of Genesis continues through similar plot conflicts, highlighting chosen seeds along the way, leading up to the point of Jacob and his 12 grandsons. At the very end of Genesis, Jacob breaks into song in a huge poetic section of the book where he blesses his 12 grandsons, his seed. We learn in Genesis 49 that the promise that was made to the seed of the woman all the way back in Genesis 3 is being passed on through Jacob's offspring, his 12 grandsons, who will later become the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob talks about the last days in this chapter, and prophesies that from out of the family of his grandson Judah, a triumphant king will arise, restoring Eden-like peace to the world. If we follow this plot point further, we find the Old Testament prophets all pointing back to Jacob's prophecy to Judah as being about the coming Messiah, who will be called, as Isaiah says, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Jumping forward again to the New Testament, we learn that Jesus came as the Son of God to save the world from the curse of sin by defeating Satan at the cross. While this story might seem to a lot of people today to be just as weird and mystical as a story about a talking snake, even that similarity seems to indicate that these two narratives fit together. The ancient Christians certainly thought so. They saw direct connections between Genesis 3:15 and Jesus' triumphant death and resurrection. The Apostle John, one of Jesus' closest friends, didn't even question Genesis 3's messianic implications when he wrote, "And he was thrown down, that ancient serpent who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power of the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come." So, is Genesis 3:15 about Jesus' victory over Satan? The majority of Christian history and Jewish tradition seem to agree that the messianic prophecy found here is a cornerstone of the rest of the Bible's hope in the coming Messiah, who was revealed in Jesus Christ. While it might feel like a stretch of the imagination, oftentimes that's just what good biblical interpretation feels like.